right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Amy Spong. I'm the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. And before we jump in with our keynote session this afternoon, I wanted to really quickly give a shout out to our sponsors who are the City of Stillwater, the Stillwater Heritage Preservation Commission, and Abby Whitman, who is a planner and staffs the Heritage Preservation Commission. The Hbcus and the city have financially contributed to this conference. We were all hoping we were going to be in Stillwater last year for our conference last year, and then again this year we were hoping to be in Stillwater, and unfortunately that just could not happen. So I would just encourage anyone to go visit Stillwater, see the great preservation work that they are doing in that community if you get a chance to do that. And finally, one of the things I was going to mention that they've also participated, we had to get a little creative with how do you have a city sponsor for a virtual conference. And one of the things that they got creative about and did is a training video that is going to be shown in our Friday session in the window repair. So just a shout out for that session. So without further delay, I am going to go ahead and introduce our Commissioner of Administration, Alice Roberts Davis, and she also serves as the governor-appointed State Historic Preservation Officer in Minnesota. Commissioner?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Brent Leggs and welcome him as the keynote speaker to PreserveMN, the 41st Annual Statewide Historic Preservation Conference. Mr. Leggs is the Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the largest preservation campaign in U.S. history on behalf of historic African American places. The Action Fund was launched in 2017 with the goal of saving and restoring the ordinary and extraordinary places that tell us who we are as Americans and where we've been as Black people. Over the past 4 years, the Trust has funded 105 historic places connected to Black history and invested more than $7.3 million to preserve landscapes and buildings imbued with Black life, humanity, and cultural heritage. The Action Fund has helped preserve places like Nina Simone's childhood home in North Carolina and Vernon Amy Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Last year, the city of Minneapolis received a grant to conduct community engagement for an African American historic context study and develop strategies for protecting memorials related to George Floyd. Earlier this summer, they received $20 million from Mackenzie Scott, which means Brent and his colleagues now have even more support to pursue what he describes as the quiet power of preservation. A native of Kentucky, Brent received an MBA from the University of Kentucky with a specialization in finance and real estate. But after graduating, Brent realized that corporate America didn't match his personality, so he began the process of soul-searching for something that fit his spirit and creativity. A chance encounter with Dennis Domer, the chair of the Graduate Historic Preservation Program at the University of Kentucky, changed the trajectory of Brent's career and ultimately brought him to the vaulted level of respect he has now garnered among national and international preservationists. Through the Action Fund, Mr. Leggs leads a broad community of leaders and activists in honor of the clarion that preserving African American cultural sites is fundamental to understanding the American story. Brent is a Harvard University Loeb Fellow, author of Preserving African American Historic Places, and the 2018 recipient of the Robert G. Stanton National Preservation Award. He is also an adjunct associate professor and senior advisor to the Center for Preservation of Civil Rights Sites at the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Weitzman School of Design. It is such a distinct honor to have you here today, Mr. Leggs. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Commissioner. I'm going to share my screen and pull up my PowerPoint. I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., and I am honored to deliver the keynote address for this year's statewide conference. Preservation is about people, and it's about places, and it's about stories. What I want to do is to expand on Commissioner's introduction of my personal journey and story in historic preservation. And as I'm doing this, I want you to think about your own personal connection and what's motivated you to dedicate yourself to this social cause. So I'm from Kentucky, and when I went to grad school at the University of Kentucky to attain a master's degree in historic preservation, Dr. Dennis Domer, thankfully, invited me to conduct a statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. I'm sure many of you have heard about this social movement in response to a crisis in Black education, which we call today a Rosenwald Schools program. During this 1.5 year long research process, I learned that my mom and dad and aunts and uncles attended Rosenwald schools in central Kentucky. I also learned about the important and innovative work of Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee, including the remarkable work of Robert Taylor, who is America's first licensed African-American architect and graduate of MIT. I learned that George Washington Carver, the peanut butter guy, was the de facto landscape designer for Rosenwald schools. But what was most important is I began to discover the quiet power of preservation. And what I mean is that when I was touring a school, I started to realize that I was having an immersive and interactive experience with this cultural heritage. I could see the sunlight shining through broken window glass panes. I could literally smell the decay inside of an abandoned building. I could touch and see and have that sensory response. But I also started to understand that preservation was more than multisensory. It also was transcendent and spiritual. That's because preservation helps to reduce the gap between space and time, unlike any other form of history. Preservation makes the Rosenwald School story, a story of multiracial cooperation, come to life. It reminds us of our social responsibility to continue the legacy work of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald in helping to uplift Black America through education. Together, these gentlemen and allies and the Black community and local school districts would help to fund over 5,000 school buildings in 15 southern states. It is certainly the largest movement in American education. And this story is a story that we all can be proud of. Preservation makes Washington and Rosenwald's remarkable lives once lived real. We thank you. I believe deeply in the words of Dr. King, who said, "We are not makers of history, we are made by history." Keep this quote in mind. Now, if we were in person, I would ask the audience, who's heard of cultural icon Beyonce? And I'm sure many of you know of Beyonce and her art and music. So on her visual album, Lemonade, she shared these words, which I think are powerful. And for me, it connected me back to our important work. The past and the future merge to meet us here. The past and the future merge to meet us here. Keep this in mind. Since the first European slave ship arrived to the New World, arrived to America in 1619 with its more than 20 enslaved Africans. Black America has been fighting against the legacies of slavery, legacies that are weaved in all aspects of contemporary life and society. We continue to fight against cultural inequity. So all of us know the founding story of the U.S. preservation movement, where Pamela and Cunningham and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association would organize themselves to preserve a threatened landmark, the home of President George Washington, which you see here on the screen, called Mount Vernon. In essence, that success story birthed our profession, created the House Museum as the leading model for reuse. It also has led to inequity within our historical record and the National Register of Historic Places. We continue to fight against urban renewal and erasure. This is a historic Black neighborhood called Brooklyn that was once in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can imagine the impacts of urban renewal in urban markets across the United States. I'm actually sitting in Southwest DC in a neighborhood called Waterfront that experienced massive displacement, both culturally and racially. It's unfortunate when we see historical images like this, because I think about the loss of Black capital, financial, intellectual, cultural, because of this erasure. We continue to fight against redlining and disinvestment. I want to read some words from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which states, for decades, starting at least in the 1930s, low-income and minority communities were intentionally cut off from lending and investment through a system known as redlining. Today, those same neighborhoods suffer not only from reduced wealth and greater poverty, but from lower life expectancy and higher incidence of chronic diseases that are risk factors for poor outcomes from COVID-19. You begin to see the intersection between racial justice and architecture, the intersection between health and wellness and disinvested historic built environments. Our community continues to fight against racial terrorism. This is Mother Emanuel Amy Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We remember the graphic and gruesome images when in 2015, a lone white nationalist would enter this church and assassinate 9 members. We provided our largest grant of $150,000 in our inaugural year of the National Grant Program, which was in 2018, to help uplift this church in their effort for reconciliation and to partially fund restoration of the historic sanctuary. We continue to fight against disrespect. This hit close to home because this is the African Meeting House in Nantucket, Massachusetts. It is the second oldest extant Black church building in the United States. It's also part of our National Trust Historic Sites portfolio. These words represent that racism is not stereotypically defined just to the South, that it is all across our country, and we continue to fight against disrespect and arson and vandalism. We're also fighting against symbols of hate. I want to read from an op-ed that I wrote in the art newspaper London. And I opened up with a quote from artist Pablo Picasso, who once said, "Art is the lie that enables us to realize the truth." In this op-ed I wrote, "White supremacy, like the lost cause its monuments represent, is a false narrative, a construct. Its permanent markers of pride and prejudice in public spaces are a false truth in physical form, as art and preservation has contributed to more than a century of historical inaccuracies about American history. The people of this nation, through their dissent and collective affirmation of these concerns, have grown impatient with policy that gives cover to ideas that oppose our democracy's goals." This isn't just a national issue, as you can see from the monuments that have been relocated and removed. It's also an international issue. And we continue to fight against systemic racism. So this is another National Trust historic site. It is the Decatur House here in Washington, D.C. And during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest movement in D.C., an unnamed protester would write these words on the side of the Decatur House saying, "Why do we have to keep telling you Black Lives Matter?" In essence, this demonstrates, and we are witnessing how a new generation will express their cultural values in public space. And it's our responsibility to harness the power of preservation in response to this provocative question. Can we do that? Is there a role for us in this fight for social justice? So I love this quote from Dr. Maya Angelou. "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." I want to highlight some examples of preservation and social justice. In 1917, after 16 years of failed attempts by Booker T. Washington, Black fraternities, Congress, and others, the National Association of Colored Women organized themselves and launched the first national campaign by a BIPOC preservation grassroots organization. They were successful in their campaign. They raised enough money to pay off the mortgage of Cedar Hill, the home of Frederick Douglass here in Washington, D.C. We all know that Frederick Douglass is a famed abolitionist and social critic. These women wanted to showcase that that site could be a mecca for Black Americans to draw inspiration in the fight for social justice. Once they raised the money and paid off the mortgage, wired the house for electricity, and restored the house, they opened it up to receive 4,000 visitors on its very first day in 1922. Professionals of color in historic preservation know, or should know, that we stand on their shoulders and legacy. So I have the good fortune of being the founding executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We remember this image in 2017 when white nationalists rallied around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of University of Virginia, a World Heritage Site in Virginia. This was one of the rare moments that historic preservation was part of a national discourse. It was a moment where culture, heritage, and public spaces collided in the most negative and violent ways. We thought that there was an opportunity for historic preservation to provide innovation and to contribute to the social innovation and cultural innovation needed to rectify our racist past and the conflicts in the present moment caused by our racist past. I remember watching on TV and hearing the words, "You will not replace us. The South will rise again." It was unimaginable to see folks that look like our neighbors wearing khaki pants and polo shirts and holding tiki torches in the dark of night, advocating for a new form, a modern form of Jim Crow, separate but equal. Thus, the Action Fund was born as a $25 million campaign to help support the preservation of African American historic places for this bold idea that through this program and our partnerships, we could begin the journey of helping to tell the full American story. So our vision is that the Action Fund is about making room within our understanding of history, preservation, and social justice. It is a platform and movement for having a positive impact on people's lives and our society. Then the first thing that we wanted to do was to build a new form of partnership and community. And this is exciting for our entire profession, that we have national thought leaders and philanthropists that are coalescing around this idea of telling the full American story. Darren Walker is the co-chair along with Felicia Rashad. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation. We have as a National Advisory Council member, Dr. Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian, and currently the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. And then other leaders like Congresswoman Terry Sewell of Alabama, or Sherilyn Ifill, who leads the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. It is an honor to work with such an esteemed community that is proactively advocating on behalf of diversity in American history. And talk about reimagining preservation practice. I know that you all have heard of this site, James Madison's Montpelier. If you haven't toured it, I encourage you to do so. A couple of years ago, the organization, in partnership with the National Trust, worked with the Descendant Committee and community to reimagine the interpretation and to honor the enslaved workers at this historic plantation site. Presently in the basement of this grand home is a permanent exhibition titled The Mere Distinction of Color. It is one of the most innovative new exhibitions that I've toured, because it not only highlights or presents to the public the story of the enslaved, but it connects the legacies of slavery at this site. So it talks about, in one of the videos, policing and the impact of that on Black bodies. It spans centuries in its understanding of the importance of this site and its often overlooked history. This is an example where equitable interpretation is central to the long-term viability of historic sites, and historic sites that bring forward diverse narratives and stories are helping to move our profession forward in powerful and meaningful ways. One of the more recent developments, which I think has the potential to be a world model for traditional sites, is the Descendant Committee. So a community of descendants, both from the site, but also within the region, have organized after 20 years, formalized as a nonprofit. And they have been collaborating over the last year with the foundation to develop a shared governance and authority model that creates structural parity in the governance of this site. Once this process is complete, this will transform the ways that traditional historic sites partner with BIPOC communities. I know that you've heard of President Woodrow Wilson, who is acclaimed for his international policies. but he's also known for segregating the federal government. We wanted to bring together artists and creatives to reimagine this site's story. So we partnered with David Yarborough, who you see here on the left, and students from Wellington High School. They developed a new composition that highlighted the DC counter-protest movement of the 1960s. It was performed inside of President Woodrow Wilson's house using his piano. And the project was led by an African-American interpretation specialist. It's exciting to see the new ways that we can tell stories that are relevant to communities today. In Shacklebottom, Virginia, is the second largest slaveholding center in the United States. For almost 4 decades, it was the epicenter of the slavery economy in the US. If you tour the site today, you will walk across parking lots and concrete and pavement and have no understanding that you are standing on a sacred archaeological site. We initially got involved because of an inappropriate development threat about an $80 million proposed mixed-use development, including a minor league baseball stadium, a Kroger store, a Hyatt hotel, would be developed on this site. And through our legal advocacy and partnership with the preservationists in Richmond and across the state, we were able to defeat that. We then transitioned to support the grassroots preservationists in developing a community-driven vision for memorialization, education, and economic development. We funded an equitable development study to help make the financial arguments. You know, our profession is great at making moral arguments, but we have to balance that with also making financial arguments and highlighting the economic benefits of historic preservation. This is an example that when the physical evidence of our past is no longer visible, how do we preserve and commemorate history that is important to the community? This is their vision. Now I want to talk about preservation as equity. As you heard, our National Grant Program is the signature pillar of the Action Fund. But I wanted to highlight these statistics because they affirm that African American historic places have been underfunded and undervalued. 2,400 proposals requesting almost $250 million. And we know that's just a drop in the bucket for the overall need to preserve the material culture, to continue and sustain the organizations that steward that culture, and to do the important work of education and public engagement. We funded places like the Paul Robeson House in Philadelphia. This organization envisions this site not only to help tell his remarkable story in civil rights and social justice and education and sports and arts and culture. He certainly is a Renaissance man. But they really view this site as a cultural institution that anchors the West Philadelphia neighborhood to be able to ground the cultural heritage as a way to uplift the community. And through our grant making, we provided $140,000 to help them hire their first paid executive director after being in existence for more than 4 decades. Now, I'm sure you've heard of these names, Alice and John Coltrane. Inside of this ranch-style house in New York is where John composed his masterpiece, A Love Supreme. He spent a week isolated in the second floor bedroom and would create this amazing piece of living art. Alice Coltrane, after John passed away, would remain in the house, and she recorded her first 5 studio albums in their basement studio. What's beautiful about this project is it helps to advance this idea of equitable interpretation, that we uplift the contributions of Black women in American music and jazz which has been overlooked and under-recognized. I'm sure you've heard the name August Wilson. This is his home in the historic Hill District in Pittsburgh. So August Wilson wrote 10 plays about the Black experience in Pittsburgh. And more recently, they have come to TV. So think Fences or Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. What I think is great about this example is you can see visually how many historic sites from BIPOC communities are limited spatially. So you have to find creative ways to engage the public, and that is to leverage the landscape, the lawn, the streetscape, to be able to bring community together through the cultural heritage of a site. I'm sure you love New Orleans and New Orleans culture like I do. This is a project that's in the historic Treme Historic District in New Orleans. We had the opportunity to partner with a local organization to pilot a new project. They call it Revival Grants. So the Black residents that have owned houses in this neighborhood for decades were being penalized and fined by code enforcement for not maintaining the exterior of their homes to a certain standard. These fines kept building and growing because the low-income homeowners didn't have the money to pay off the code, the fines, and to renovate their houses. What's unfortunate about this is the contradiction of historic preservation. This district was created not because of its architectural significance, but because of the cultural significance of this community. Yet integrity and the architectural integrity factor is at play. So the Revival Grant helps to fund the renovation of the front facades, and it pays off the fines so that historic preservation is not a financial burden to these residents. Here's the Oligwood Cemetery in Houston, Texas, one of our recent grantees from July of this year. This is an example where preservation intersects environmental justice. We funded $50,000 for them to develop a drainage plan because the site sits below significant development and there's a lot of water runoff that's impacting the headstones and the grave site, and that is a serious threat to the sacred landscape and space. Whippendale Ladies Club, one of our early grantees. What I think is beautiful about this story is we don't often hear stories about the Black middle class experience. We also don't hear stories about the ways that Black women have self-organized and brought together their limited resources to create space for themselves. Almost 80 years ago, 50 Black women would pull together their resources, buy this grand, elegant estate, and they would operate their club. It really is a special place in Los Angeles's history, but they are facing some of the same issues that many historic sites face. They have an aging board. They are trying to find relevancy in a shifting demographic and neighborhood context. They are searching for new ideas for reusing the site to generate income and support the preservation of that historic asset as well as the organization. I'm sure you have heard of the name Pauli Murray. She is an icon that should be celebrated. Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. She is a co-founder of the National Organization of Women, first African-American Episcopal saint. She termed the phrase Jane Crow. I could go on and on about her legacy. We funded the development of an interpretation plan as well as helping to restore the exterior of the home. And I am excited for when this site opens up next year as a Pauli Murray Center for Social Justice. You probably saw recently news about Vernon Amy Church that's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because of the 100th anniversary of the largest racial massacre in U.S. history. Last year, we provided $150,000 to help the church restore their historic stained glass windows. And they have been restored in advance of the anniversary. This place is special because it's one of the only standing remnants from that racial massacre. I advocate that this is an example where we can balance public memory. The Black experience in Tulsa and nationally isn't just one rooted in racial violence. This community was once the epicenter of Black commerce nationwide. The number of Black businesses that thrived inside of this isolated community because of segregation, that cultural legacy still lives on and needs to be reignited to help revitalize this historic neighborhood. You probably heard of Robert's Temple in Chicago. This is a moment that exemplifies the character of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Mobley Till, who made the decision to hold an open casket funeral so the world could see what happened to her son in Mississippi. This site showcases the character, the self-determination and agency, and the resilience of Black women. We currently are in a quiet phase working to create a national park with a discontiguous boundary that includes Robert Temple, so sites in Chicago as well as Mississippi. You probably have heard of a place called Claiborne Temple in Memphis. Many of you probably have toured the Civil Rights Museum at the Lewaro Motel. This is in that same neighborhood. Inside of the basement is where the I Am a Man posters were pressed and designed. From the front steps of this church is where Dr. King led 15,000 sanitation workers in a protest and march to City Hall. We funded their first preservation manager's position to help oversee the stewardship and renovation of this cultural asset. This is a really powerful historical moment where the where the civil rights movement became more sophisticated, linking together political activism and the fight for economic justice. I wanted to include 16th Street Baptist Church in my talk because I want us to take a moment to remember the 4 girls murdered on this day in 1963. We honor you, we remember you, and this is why it is so important that 16th Street Baptist Church stands to tell its story so that we never forget what happened there. So Nina Simone, what I love about this project is 4 New York City-based visual artists using their words, they really saw this project as a form of arts activism and politics. They would create an LLC, purchase the property, and partner with us to develop a stewardship plan and strategy for its preservation and reuse. Nina Simone, she overcame the constraints placed on Black female performers in the mid-20th century to become the voice of the American Civil Rights Movement. And after the killing of those 4 girls, she would write a song called Mississippi, Goddamn, in protest. As you heard from the commissioner, we were honored to provide $50,000 investment to the city of Minneapolis to develop a historic context statement that looked at the historical legacy of the Black community there but that also was developing strategies for the commemoration and conservation of living history. It is critical that we not only look to that 50-year benchmark, but that we are proactive in documenting and interpreting contemporary historical events like this. We will say your name and we will never forget. Last, I want to talk about preservation as culture. I love this place. It's so rare to see an African-American landmark that is both architecturally and culturally significant. This is the home of Madam C.J. Walker in Irvington, New York. She is America's first self-made female millionaire. Born in 1867 in Delta, Louisiana, first person in her family born free, she would create a formula to help Black women's hair grow and be healthy, would train and employ more than 23,000 sales agents across the U.S. and South America. And in 1918, she partnered with Vernon Amy, first Black licensed architect in the state of New York, to build this elegant historic residence that embodies the spirit of American entrepreneurship. Constructed on the same street as J. Gould's Lyndhurst and 3 miles from the Rockefeller Estate, Kikett. In 1917, the New York Times Magazine wrote that when Madam Walker was on site, checking on the progress of the construction of her home, that the neighbors thought that she was the maid. Only to find out that she was the owner of this property, and she did all of this before women had the right to vote. None of the furnishings are original, but the house retains 99% of its architectural integrity, and I'm pleased to say that the National Trust holds its first easement on a Black landmark here at Villa Lewaro with exterior and partial interior protections. HBCUs. There are 105 HBCUs in the United States. These institutions have created more Black graduates at the undergrad and grad level than any other academic institutions. It is a space that breeds culture and legacy and instills a sense of pride and character that's hard to replicate in other academic spaces. But HBCUs, because of the inequity in the way that we fund education, have faced issues of deferred maintenance, a lack of preservation planning, and professionals that oversee the stewardship of their historic landscapes and campuses and buildings. So we created a new program, an HBCU Cultural Heritage Stewardship Initiative, have partnered with 8 HBCUs, and yesterday received great news from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation of a $1.2 million investment to help us continue this program over the next 3 years. And at that point, we will have worked with 24 HBCUs, funding individual building and campus-wide plans, and partnering, providing technical advice, and helping to equip them with the tools to be effective stewards of this exceptionally important cultural heritage. And last, the A.G. Gaston Motel in Birmingham, Alabama. Civil rights is an imbued legacy of Black America. In the spring of 1963, Black men, women, and children organized themselves who were armed only with the truth and a spiritual battle against immorality, would test and affirm the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. I'm glad to say today that this once vacant motel, currently going through restoration, is now the centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, and it ensures that Birmingham's contribution, this moment when they broke the back of segregation across the South, that story will live on and remember the impact and sacrifice of the foot soldiers there. So to build a true national identity, what we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world void of national bias, race, hate, and religious prejudice. I believe deeply that our nation must revere and uplift Black culture and assets as American history. This is our shared experience. We must partner with intention to reduce historical inequities, and we must innovate to achieve measurable, quantifiable, equity-driven outcomes. My hope for our profession is that preservation organizations at the national, statewide, and local level begin to center diversity and equity at the core of their missions and create space for diverse leadership to provide innovation in our profession and field. We can harness the power of preservation and the power of place to foster truth, healing, and reconciliation. This is American history. It's complicated. It's sometimes painful, but it's also hopeful and optimistic. The places that we preserve to tell the experience of Black America are stories of resilience, activism, and achievement that are fundamental to building a true national identity. I leave you with this. The past and the present merge to meet us here. What future can we create together to ensure that BIPOC communities can see themselves and their history and their potential on the American landscape and in the communities that surround them? Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to chime in. Looks like Amy's ready to jump in as well. We do have 10 minutes or so, a few more than that, for any questions or comments from people that were attending Brent's keynote address. And thank you very much, Brent. That was very, very inspiring. So if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to unmute and speak up, or you could put something in chat as an alternative. And Amy, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free to jump in.
I was just going to say that while we wait, I wish that we would have had an applause button, but we don't have an applause button here. But thank you so much for the message. And you know, this virtual way is not, when we're in person, there's a lot more collaboration and networking that happens. And so we did have over 80 of us listening in, and I think we all need to just kind of imagine us all in a large auditorium hearing this great message and presentation. So thank you very much, Brent.
I appreciate that. And I hope the listeners won't be shy to type in a comment or a question. You know, as I was,
Minnesotans are known for being a bit reticent and shy, Brent, so this may take a little prodding, but I'll just throw something out. We know that from statistics that the National Register of Historic Places has, that sites associated with African Americans are a very small minority. I believe it's 2% or somewhere in that vicinity that are represented in the register. Mm-hmm. We also, I think, have started to have conversations about trying to remedy that by having the register look at the criteria that properties can be listed, can be identified and evaluated for listing. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about the prospects for that and the ability of us to make some, programmatic changes, substantive changes to the National Register program to allow for additional sites associated with African Americans, as well as underrepresented community members to be listed.
Yeah, that is a really thoughtful question. So I go back and forth on whether or not we need to revise the nomination process. I believe that our profession needs to have a shared vision and to have a national ethic, that we will be working towards those equity-driven outcomes that I mentioned at the end of my talk, to say that our national inventory and historical record will represent the current demographics of social and ethnic communities. So with the Black community being 11-12% of the US population, it should not be 2%. It should be at least at a minimum 11%. What we also know is that of the almost 100,000 places listed in the National Register, that there are stories of social and ethnic communities, but they aren't connected to the nomination. They're not being interpreted. So a lot of the work is to amend what's already been registered. It is to have an ethic at our state historic preservation offices and statewide local preservation organizations, as well as national organizations, to say that we are committed to recording places of cultural significance, and that we will value cultural significance as much as we value architecture and architectural integrity. I also think we need to spend some time with communities and grassroots organizations that are on the ground, that do this hard work every single day, and understand, what does the Black communities desire? Think about Shaka Bottom, for example, this, rare cultural landscape that doesn't have a lot of historic fabric. What kind of designation would be appropriate for a site like that, when the community still has a cultural memory and connection to that heritage, as well as that landscape? Same thing for Latinx and other communities. What do they value? And how can we leverage existing and potentially new tools that empowers them to be the advocates on behalf of America's diverse history? So this is just a long way of me saying, I don't know that there are any easy solutions, and I don't know that modifying the existing nomination process is going to fast track the equity-driven outcomes that we desire. I think it will take a national agenda and a shared vision to achieve something that would be substantial and lasting.
Thank you very much. I've been looking at the chat. I'm not seeing any questions or comments that people have entered.
There's actually, Mike, I can see several questions here.
Oh, sorry, then I'm not looking in the right place. Go right. Go ahead, Amy.
So I'm happy to take them. Someone else was also looking for the applause button, but I will just take them in order here. And the first one I see, how can we get more persons of color engaged in preservation activities and feel like they are welcome and engaged?
Yeah, we've been looking for strategies like this, and so we partnered with the Fitch Foundation, and they're providing just small $5,000 grants to HBCU students that have participated in our HBCU Stewardship Initiative. We have created fellowship programs where we create space for students and professionals to share their ideas and perspectives. We have a program called Hope Crew, which stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience, and we work with youth between the ages of 18 to 25, and they learn the basics of preservation trades, and it's really an entry point for them to be introduced to historic preservation as a potential career opportunity, while they're also being connected to the history in their community. And then lastly, I would say that when we developed the HBCU initiative, we were intentional about working with board of trustees, the president, director of campus facilities, and students in School of Architecture and Design. And just this summer, we piloted a new digital documentation program working at a landmark site in Harlem with students from Hampton, Morgan State University, and Tuskegee University. And as part of our HBCU program, we wanted to use this as an opportunity to create professional development opportunity. So one student has a paid position to be part of the consulting team that is developing the individual campus-wide plan. So this is a quick but kind of a thorough way of highlighting several examples that I don't know that it has to be overly complicated in the ways that we engage. If we have projects and additional funding to be able to pay and attract students, I think that is a smart approach. The bigger challenge is helping to make arguments that preservation is relevant to diverse communities. It is really difficult, as we all know, to engage the broader Black community and diverse community in the work of preservation. And somehow I think the message is, how do we make it personal? How do we help them understand the tools available through historic preservation and the many benefits to their community? And so in some ways, I think the onus is on our profession to do a better job at making that argument.
Great, thank you. I know we have a few more minutes here. See what I can find. There's actually a few more popping up. One question, The Atlantic recently did a story on the efforts to establish the Emmett Till National Park, specifically about the little-known barn in which he was murdered. Has anything subsequently happened with a potential procurement of the site and on the broader effort?
Yes. So we've had conversations with the current owner of the barn, and there are two discussions at play. One is site acquisition. You all know that the National Park Service needs an ownership stake, a real estate interest in units of the national park system. But we want to make sure that this place, independent of national park status, is preserved. So we've had conversations about acquisition, more recent conversations about the National Trust holding an easement on the barn. And it's complicated, as you can imagine, because it's a family residence and it's currently occupied. We also are looking at the site where Emmett Till's body was recovered from the river. There's also the store where he supposedly whistled at the woman. And even though that's a ruin, it would be, in our minds, great to be able to acquire that site. But the family is holding out at an exorbitant and inflated market value. And in our recent conversations with Dr. Parker, who is the last surviving witness, he's based in Chicago and minister of Robert's Temple, their biggest concern is that we are not funding white supremacy, such as buying at an inflated rate the grocery store. And they want to find ways that preservation helps to uplift the Black community in Mississippi, especially in the Delta, that continues to live below the poverty level. And so we're thinking holistically about site protection and interpretation, but we're also trying to find strategies that, again, supports preservation to be an economic driver for the Black community in Mississippi.
Wonderful. I know we're at time. I'm wondering if we can do one more question, and I'm kind of combining two of them here. Following up on those, identifying properties for the National Register. Do you have any thoughts or strategies for those places that are considered not eligible for the National Register? And then there was a second question about, is the National Park Service currently looking at changes to those criteria and standards to improve upon eligibility?
So yes, the National Park Service is looking at a process for review and is considering ways to make the National Register more equitable. So that is ongoing. So previously, there were two projects that I worked on, and one was Hinchliffe Stadium, a Negro League ballpark that today is designated a National Historic Landmark, but it was first listed in the National Register for being regionally significant. And so when we were creating the Patterson-Great Falls National Historical Park, we made sure to include a sentence that additional scholarship and research needed to happen at Hinchliffe to understand significance. And because of that, working with a PhD scholar, we would discover that there, of the 188 former Negro League venues, that two extant places are nationally significant. Hinchliffe Stadium was one. And again, today it is the only National Historic Landmark in all of baseball. There's the Avicennial Meeting House that's in Portland, Maine, and it was denied several times by the State Historic Preservation Office because of the integrity issue. We found a preservation engineer that pulled back the layers of history and material culture and discovered the remnants that helped us make the case that the building could be converted back from being multifamily apartments back to its historic use as a religious building. And I'm glad to say that today the building is in the National Register. So I think sometimes we have to be more sophisticated in the ways that we make our arguments and leverage the most sophisticated tools to be able to advocate on behalf of the history.
Thank you so much. Well, I know we have another session coming up at 2:15, so we need to give probably you a break and all of us a little break. Mike, did you have any additional closing?
Nothing other than Brent will be joining us for that next session at 2:15 on the Black Lives Matter, or at least for part of it. So hopefully if additional questions come up or comments, people will be able to weigh in, and we're grateful that Brent will be joining us. Otherwise, that's it.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody.
Afternoon.